In John chapter 13, we have the recording of the Last Supper, at which time Jesus said to them, "One of you will betray me." In that chapter 13, if we just look at, starting at verse 22, it says, his disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" So it does seem like John, the gospel writer John, has a special relationship or a close relationship with Jesus, closer than what the others experienced. Peter sensed this, and to get some sense of his personality as well, he doesn't ask Jesus directly for fear that he may come across as being too nosy. And so he asked or told John to ask Jesus who would be the betrayer. Jesus made it plain who the betrayer was, but the disciples didn't pick up on it. They just couldn't believe that Jesus was actually singling out Judas. And so they all promised to stick with Jesus to the end. "We'll be there with you." And Peter said, "I'll lay down my life for you." In verse 37, "I'll lay down my life for you." And then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? I'll tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But they all had every intention of sticking with Jesus. But that was in the abstract. That was when they weren't forced to confront reality. And if we just think back to Valentine's Day, think about the high school security resource officer in Parkland, Florida, who waited outside the building while 17 students and staff were being shot to death on the inside. This was his purpose. This was his time. This was his opportunity to build upon all the previous commendations and awards he had received in the past. He wasn't just a security monitor whose duty it was to alert law enforcement. He was law enforcement. But he had a different perspective on what was going on. He knew what was going on in his own mind. However, to outside observers, he failed and is being vilified from top to bottom. And now he may never have another opportunity to redeem himself. But what can he do? How can he be reconciled to the community and his colleagues? And we have to think ourselves, all our second guessing and our good intentions, they don't count. All the bravado talking about running into an active shooter situation unarmed, it doesn't count. Jesus' disciples, they were confronted with the equivalent of an active shooter situation. When it was time for Jesus to face his destiny, they all fled. One even lost his clothes trying to get away in such a hurry. We do know that at least Peter and John regrouped and followed Jesus to the high priest's courtyard. And it appeared that John was able to follow Jesus into it, while Peter stayed outside, warming himself with the others around the fire. And some of those standing with Peter thought they recognized him as one of the disciples. He denied it and started cursing over and over and denying it over and over. And that third time, it says in Luke, and I'll just read it this time, Luke 22:60 says, just as he was speaking, just as he was denying Jesus a third time, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. So after 3 years of walking with Jesus, and now saying, I never saw him a day before in my life, it was at that moment that Peter's eyes locked onto Jesus' eyes, and the rooster crowed, and a dumpster load of guilt buried Peter, who then ran away weeping, knowing that this was his moment, this was his opportunity, this was his test, and he failed. How can he be redeemed? How can he be reconciled to the one he let down? Fortunately, Jesus knew Peter's heart and took the first step. After Jesus' resurrection, he caught up with some of the disciples on a fishing trip. He gave them some advice on how to catch fish. They were so unsuccessful up to this point. Just throw the net on the other side, and by the results, they knew it was Jesus who had called out to them. And then they caught so many fish, brought it back, they had breakfast, and this is where we pick up with Jesus and Peter being reconciled. In John 21, if we start looking at verse 15, it says, after that breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Master, you know I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. And there are nuances in the word for love. Jesus asking, do you have this agape love for me? And Jesus and Peter is responding, I have a dear friendship love for you. But Jesus still commissions him to feed my lambs. Then he asks a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me with this agape love? Yes, Master, you know I love you with this deep friendship love. And Jesus said, shepherd my sheep this time. And then verse 17, then he said the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? This friendship. Do you really love me? This real friendship type of love. Peter was upset that he asked the third time, do you love me? So he answered, Master, you know everything there is to know. You've got to know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. So Jesus takes the first step of reconciliation by teasing out of Peter a confession. Jesus is getting to the point, are you ready for a second chance? There is no second chance unless there's confession of what went wrong. And so Peter is under the undercurrent of all this is Jesus getting out of Peter an acknowledgement of that, yes, he failed. And Peter says, Master, you know everything there is to know. You know my ups, my downs. You know I failed. You know I'm miserable. You know this. But I still love you. And Jesus is commissioning him. So 3 times, and Peter got to the point that he's taking this calling seriously. He knows it's dead serious. And so in this exchange, Peter acknowledges that Jesus knows his weakness and that he wants to try. Peter wants to try again. And Jesus predicts that Peter will indeed follow him to the point of even dying for him, like he bragged about before being really tested. And if we go down to verse 18, I'm telling you the truth now, when you were young, you dressed yourself and went wherever you wished. But when you get old, you'll have to stretch out your hands while someone else dresses you and takes you where you don't want to go. He said this to hint at the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And he then commanded, follow me. This is, if the story ended here, this is Peter's recovery, his redemption, his reconciliation. This is his second chance to get back what he had lost when he denied Jesus 3 times. This is his opportunity. And Jesus does say, "Follow me," indicating you'll get to the point you will be able to stand up for me one more time. You will have the boldness to stand for me, and you won't deny me. They will lead you to your cross, and you will perish in my name. But in verse 20, and this was John, who had this special relationship with Jesus. Peter had already kind of moved apart from the others with Jesus. They're having this exchange. John is walking behind and overhearing this. In verse 20, turning his head, Peter noticed the disciple Jesus loved following right behind. And when Peter noticed him, he asked Jesus, "Master, what's going to happen to him?" Jesus says, "If I want him to live until I come again, what's that to you? You follow me." Peter gives the example of what not to do during the moment of reconciliation. Yes, this is an uncomfortable conversation to have. Jesus is predicting punishment. Is he predicting punishment or redemption from Peter? It's an uncomfortable conversation to have. But Peter is trying to deflect this focus away from himself. And he singles on John and asks Jesus about John. But Jesus is basically saying, keep the focus on yourself. Don't worry about anyone else. Just worry about yourself. Make sure you yourself are right with God. Don't worry if somebody else failed or if somebody else is going to have a different outcome. You just worry about your shortcomings, confess them to me, you be reconciled to me, and that's when you can be redeemed and restored. This is true reconciliation, and Peter was truly restored. He was reconciled. But the lesson is, don't think about anyone else. Think about your own shortcomings, getting right with the person you offended, not all the other people who messed up. Think about yourself and getting right. Jesus and Peter were restored. He did go on to serve his master honorably and faithfully. As far as the security resource officer, who knows what was in his mind. But yes, there's redemption for everybody. If he failed, he just has to acknowledge it. And then, just like Peter, go and serve the ones he offended. Amen. This is the basis for reconciliation. Nobody else, it's you and the person you offended. Amen. Jesus is calling us. And there may have been, and we know that there are times when we offended God, but this is the time to be reconciled with him. Also times of reconciling with others whom we may have offended. Jesus is calling us. Is there one today?